Hello, this is the backup video for European history on Wednesday, the 23rd of September, 2020. Okay. Seems all misty in here. I don't know why. All right. First off, where we have come is through ancient times and largely through the Dark Ages. The last gasp of the Dark Ages, such as they are the early Middle Ages, were the Scandinavian attacks known as the Viking raids. In Western Europe, they took the form of, in the first generation, occasional pinprick raids on monasteries and high-value targets. In the second generation, there were more serious raids, including Ragnar Lothbrok's raid on the city of Paris itself. In the third generation, in France, there was a very special solution to the Viking problem. The King of France offered Rollo, a Viking chieftain, one of the most beautiful parts of France, the region now known as Normandy, in return for Rollo basically protecting France or claiming France as his own so that Viking raiders would no longer attack. Rollo accepted the deal. He became a French duke, the Duke of Normandy, and his children and grandchildren grew up speaking French, learning French ways. And these Frenchified Vikings were like Africanized killer bees. They had the aggression of the Vikings and the sophistication of the French. You at home, make sure that you've signed in or checked in. When I did attendance, only a few of you had. The rest of you should now. So Rollo the Viking becomes Duke of Normandy, and you end up with basically Western Europe's best soldiers for the next few generations. The Normans conquer England in 1066, establishing a new English dynasty that for hundreds of years make Englishmen second-class citizens in their own land, whereas the French-speaking Normans rule as if they're ruling over a foreign populace, which they kind of are. It takes hundreds of years for that gap to be closed. In the case of the Norman conquest of Sicily and Norman conquests and rulership elsewhere, just understand, it's because these guys are so strong. And it was a Norman king, Richard Lionheart Plantagenet, that went to lead the Christian forces in the Holy Land. That's how effective these Normans were. In the east, the Viking raids went down the rivers of Russia. And actually, they give us the name for Russia. Prior to as the Vikings raid down rivers like the Volga and the Dnieper, they begin to establish trading outposts, colonies. This becomes known as the period of the Kievan Rus. And the word Rus, which is the basis for the word Russian, comes from the blue eyes of the Nordic Vikings. They were Rus. One of the more interesting legends from the Kievan Rus is the witch Baba Yaga, who wandered around the countryside riding a hut with giant chicken legs, 50 feet off the ground, eating children and, zapping people. She's the classical, evil witch from fairy tales and legends. But there were some pretty violent stories told about it. The Kievan Rus are ultimately responsible for sending a Varangian guard to the Byzantine emperor, so that like the old Roman emperors had German guards, the Byzantine emperors for a while had a Viking guard. But ultimately the Kievan Rus are conquered by the Mongols. And being conquered by the Mongols, Russia, their country, and the others, the Slavs that lived around them, basically are suppressed for several hundred years. After about 1000 AD, Europe is moving out of the Dark Ages and into a new, brighter, shinier, lighter, if you want to equate illumination with civilization, a lighter time known as the High Middle Ages. And the High Middle Ages lasts 200 or 300 years, roughly from the 900s to the 1200s AD. In the High Middle Ages, for the first time, Christendom, the lands of Western Europe, began producing first-class cities. Up until this point, during the Dark Ages, the cities of Western Europe were basically rude towns. But cities like London, Paris, and Frankfurt begin to develop a real scale of size. Even Rome gets larger. And in these towns, there is a freedom that doesn't exist in the countryside. In the countryside, there are two rules to medieval life, and I think I may have told you them. The first is, you are what your daddy does. If your daddy's a turnip farmer, you're a turnip farmer. If your daddy is a nobleman, you're a nobleman. If your daddy's a warrior, you're a warrior. God made you be born into a role, and your job is not to rise up through society, rise up. No, it's not that. It's to stay in your place and be a good, decent person in the place God put you. If God didn't want you to farm turnips, he wouldn't have had you come out of the parents who were turnip farmers. Your identity is inherited. That's one of the levels, that is basically one of the results of feudalism. Feudalism is the system of oaths and obligations that hold society together. The Lord God Almighty is atop the social order, the beasts of the natural world are at the bottom, and there are two parallel systems, like half of a pyramid. The first is the church, the second is the state. Atop the church order is the Pope. Below the Pope are the cardinals, the princes of the church, then the archbishops and bishops, and they are basically the senior nobility of the church. Atop the state are eventually the Holy Roman Emperor, the kings, the princes, the archdukes, the senior nobility of the kingdoms of Europe. Below them are the lower nobility. In the case of the church, you've got priests, monks, nuns, monsignors. In the case of the state, you've got counts, margraves, barons, baronets, and knights. They rule over localities, either parishes for church or little towns-sized or valley-sized region for state. Below the lower nobility are the warriors on the state side. Below them, on the church side, are the laity. Below the priest, monks, and nuns, I suppose I could have had equivalents of warriors, the lower clergy, basically town priests, country monks, that sort of thing. Below them in the church is the laity. The laity are all the Christian believers, and everyone in that society is expected to be a Christian believer. You inherit your faith as well as your social status. In the case of the state, you have majority of the population, peasants, serfs, and slaves. Peasants have the best opportunities. They actually can own property. They can rise up. They can even buy their full freedom. But they are bound to the land and bound to their lord. Serfs come with the property like leather bucket seats come on a luxury automobile. Serfs are like slaves, except they can't be sold off the land. Slaves, on the other hand, are human property. They have no more legal or moral status. This is funny in a Christian society. They have no more legal or moral status than a hoe, a rake, or a shovel. They are tools, they are chattel. You buy them, you sell them. However, a good Christian will still treat their slaves well. In terms of the pyramid, depending upon time and place, between 70 and 95% of the people are peasants, serfs, and slaves, are basically people bound to the land. With their muscle power and their labor, they produce the food that everyone else eats. Everyone else eats. And we speak English good right now. In the case of the church, it's the same thing. Actually, it's usually 80 to 90%, maybe higher, of the people are laity, and the rest are the small groups of priests, monks, nuns, the lower clergy and the upper clergy, and then the senior church officials. This feudal social order seems constrictive to us, but it gives them a sense of security that we lack. We Americans are nomads. We wander. I was born in Manhattan. I was raised in southern central Connecticut. I went to college in Maine. After college, I lived briefly in Connecticut again, and then I went back to Maine and lived for 23 years. Now I live in Idaho. Who knows where I'll die? Most of you will not stay in this area. Most of you will go away to the military, to the world of work, to college. Maybe you'll come back after that and try to make a living here. Maybe you'll find that you like it elsewhere. Maybe you want to see the world. There are various ways you can do that. But the likelihood of you staying here it's not 50% or more. The likelihood is that you will find your own place in the world. And there is a glory in that. There's also a profound insecurity. There's one exception to this feudal system, and that exception is cities and towns. Because in cities and towns, labor needs to be skilled in many jobs. So in cities and towns, it's filthy. You've got human and animal waste, you've got rats and roaches, you've got unwashed bodies. City air, though, is free air. It may be foul, but it's free because it's the only place. If you can get to the city and you can find a job in a dye works, making colored dyes and coloring cloth, it may be a stinking job that poisons you slowly over decades of time, but you're not a feudal peasant anymore. You're not a serf. You're not a slave. You're as free can be in the Middle Ages. So the cities are the great exception to the rule of feudalism everywhere else. The second great system or law in the Middle Ages is God and His church are at the center of all things. You are what your daddy does. God and His church are at the center of all things. The government is not involved in all sorts of things that we assume are government responsibilities today. It is the church that records the birth of low-born people, the death of low-born people, the various sacramental stages that low-born people go through. It is the church to whom people go when they need charity, the church to whom people go when they are sick for the hospital services of monks or nuns. It is to the church that people go for community. When the church bells call, everyone comes together. And it's not like most of us today who go to church and resent it, or at the very least, think that it takes time away from more fun things. I haven't gone regularly to church in a long time. I should. I just haven't found a comfortable place yet. But, so I'm not trying to be something that I'm not. But when I did go to church, there were times when I loved it, would rather have been there than anywhere else. But there were other times when I really would rather have slept in. Our society is so rich with its entertainment possibilities, with things to do, that church, where you dress up and you go and you worship, maybe you sing some songs, doesn't seem very special unless you really have a strong internal faith. But to people in the Middle Ages, the other 6 days a week, they were working in the fields. They were with their families. Church was an opportunity to contact people from the other side of town, to do something other than sweat and dig weeds. Church was a place where you mattered. And so church was the center of the community in a way that it hasn't been in Europe and in Western civilization for 400 or 500 years, except among certain families and among certain communities. By the way, one of the great differences between us and the Islamic world is that we did go through a change and our society did secularize, became less God and church oriented 500 or so years ago. The Islamic world has not gone through this. In both Turkey and Iran, they tried, and in both cases there was an Islamist counter-reaction. So one of the big differences is in the Islamic world, Islam is their entertainment, Islam is their sports, Islam is their community. Islam is their life in a way that the church simply is not for most Jews and Christians within the United States or certainly within Europe. America has many more people going to church than Western Europe does, anyway. So that's the feudal order. But in towns, there is an order. If you're a carpenter, you can't just start cutting wood, or you're going to get beaten to a bloody pulp and run out of town on a rail. No, no. If you're going to practice woodworking anywhere in this town or city's region, you have to be a member of the Guild of Carpenters. The Guild of Carpenters is a lot like a modern trade union, but it's for craftsmen. Guild carpenters have to go through a set of training. As a young boy, they are apprenticed to a master craftsman. And in return for living with the master craftsman and basically being servants of the master craftsman for a number of years, 5, 10, depending upon how old the kid is and how quickly they pick up on it and how generous the master is. For 5 or 10 years of service, every day except Sunday, the master is supposed to teach the apprentice something valuable. So that when they are old enough, they can go through the trials, which are a series of guild tests where they demonstrate a certain set of skills. And if they pass through the trials, the apprentice is no longer a servant. The apprentice becomes a journeyman carpenter. Now, the journeyman is probably booted out of town and told to go wander in the farmlands, finding what work you can. Because one of the jobs of the guild is to preserve the lifestyle of the master craftsman in the city. That means you can't have too many carpenters. Law of supply and demand says you have a few carpenters, prices are high. You have a lot of carpenters, prices are low. So they regulate the number of carpenters quite strictly. When an old master craftsman retires or dies, somebody from the countryside, a journeyman, will take their place. To become a master craftsman, you have to, again, go through a set of tests and trials where you produce a masterwork. Something truly incredible with wood if you're a carpenter, with iron or steel if you're a blacksmith. And if you do that, and if there's a space for you, you become a guild craftsman. Now, if you try to be a wildcat, if you try to not be a member of the guild and still do woodworking in the area, the carpenters are going to come after you, and they're going to hurt you. You have to be a member of the guild. If you go to a guild craftsman, you're going to spend more money than you would if you were dealing with a wildcat, because they fix prices so that everyone makes a decent living. On the other hand, guild craftsmen guarantee a certain level of quality that you might not get if you were getting some random dude who happened to know how to use a hammer and a saw. So the cities were largely separate from the countryside. They were wealth producers, and the economy was run by the guilds. Now, there were classic buildings built in the High Middle Ages. The stone castle replaces the wooden Motte and Bailey castle of the late Dark Age period. A Motte and Bailey castle basically has you build of an area that has a well. You need a well to have a castle. You need a source of water. So usually the well is on a little nub of rock. So what you do is you dig a ditch, a round ditch, and then the earth from the ditch is used to make the motte, which is a mound of earth. And you build on top of that a heavy wooden tower. And the bailey is a wooden fence around the ditch, and sometimes there's a little village at the bottom of the bailey. But what replaces that rather primitive fortification are stone castles of incredible intricacy. Castles that have murder holes hidden in the ceiling, so that if you try moving through a corridor, they can slide open and pour hot molten oil down on you, or molten lead. They can shoot arrows down at you, or throw caltrops down, so that if you step hard on the ground, a nail-like thing will go through your foot. These walls around the castles are in concentric circles or concentric rings, so that even if you break through the first gate, even if you break through the first wall, you have another wall and another gate and another wall and another gate and the final tower. And the key for a castle is time. If you can slow down the enemy, relief can arrive and drive the enemy away. If you don't slow down the enemy, if they overwhelm your defenses, relief will never get there in time. So castles are all about slowing the enemy down and allowing a few soldiers to successfully fight a lot of soldiers. So stone castles, you can picture them. If I wasn't plagued by YouTube's copyright restrictions, I would now show you a few beautiful shots of castles. The second great medieval building are cathedrals. Now, up until now, church buildings have been certainly glorious architectural expressions. In fact, when the Russians are looking to become Christian, they send a delegation, and that delegation visits Rome. And Rome is basically a series of ruins with a few, scrubbed together medieval churches, and no cathedrals. And then they go to Byzantium, and they see the Hagia Sophia, this building that has arches with half domes, with a full dome, and it's like the ceiling floats on air. This massive interior open space that is the great architectural work from the year basically 400 to 800 AD. Hagia Sophia is it. But it's still a thick-walled church that focuses on domes and arches. Cathedrals are totally different. Gothic cathedrals do not support the weight of their roofs with their walls. Up until now, if you have a big, tall church, the walls have to be super thick and the windows have to be little, scrimmy windows. What the cathedrals do is they support the weight of their roofs with something called flying buttresses, which are connections from the roof that carry the weight of the roof to a series of exterior pillars that are widely spaced. The pillars, through the flying buttresses, support the weight of the roof. The walls, therefore, can be thin and even glass. So in the Middle Ages, you've got these beautiful stained glass windows telling the stories of the Bible or of the region and their faithful or of patron saints or whatever along the windows. And if you have never, regardless of your faith, if you have an opportunity to go into a cathedral in daytime with the lights out, just see the natural light through the stained glass, the quality of light is like nothing else I've ever experienced. It is an incredible, you're being bathed in light, and you feel it, and it's quiet, and it's beautiful. And at night, if you have a candlelit ceremony inside a cathedral, the stained glass has a different quality. It's darker, but it still affects the area. So the cathedral is not a defensive work. It is not a practical building. It is an expression of faith in the glory and majesty of God, designed to draw the attention of the people upwards to walls of light, of colored light. They are the first new architectural style developed purely in the West. Castles have analogs in the East, but not cathedrals, not Gothic cathedrals. The third great institution, and I'm going to bounce ahead a little bit, is the university. As cathedrals are built, schools are set up to help pay for them, and these schools educate the children of noblemen, the children of guildsmen, and very bright children from other classes. And as time goes on, they educate more and more people for really serious adult jobs, like the law, for example. In order to have a first-class intellectual life, the people involved, the students and the teachers, need to be able to express ideas that would get you stoned to death in the outside world. You need to be able to think forbidden thoughts, to ask uncomfortable questions, to be creative and brainstorm without worrying, am I going to get burned at the stake as a witch or as a heretic? So what begins to happen is that these cathedral schools begin being walled off like Jewish ghettos. And they become the first European universities, like the University of Paris. Why are there walls around the university? Because the university is one of the only places in society where you can question the theology of the church, where you can question the legitimacy of the monarch, where you can question whether feudalism is the best way to organize society, or the guilds are the best way to organize cathedrals. These dangerous ideas are allowed within the glockus of the university. It's safe there. If you ever wonder why I have such a grievance against the politically correct totalitarianism of modern colleges and universities, where people have to live under speech codes, where people have to prove that they are not a racist, that they do not have white privilege, or any other ideological litmus test that they are being faced with, where students like my niece, who are libertarian, not even conservative, get surrounded in a classroom just after a discussion in a history classroom by a group of activist students saying, "We hope you burn," with the professor smiling and looking on. When I was in college in I was there in the mid to late 80s, I was an open conservative. That was rare, it was annoying, but you know, I'm tough in certain ways, and I was happy to make the arguments. But my wife, when she was my girlfriend, she was a traitor to her sex because she was a conservative woman, and all women should be feminists. And I was a traitor to my race because my father's Cuban Puerto Rican, and all Hispanics should be liberals. People actually said this to us, and we laughed and we went right back at them. But in today's university climate, in most colleges, state and private, there is this strong ideological Puritanism that says if you're not one of us, we will make you suffer. We being not only students, but the administration and the faculty. I hate that. And I hate it because I'm a teacher. And I love awakening minds. If I ever do that, I don't know, but I try. I love asking questions and getting people to think. I love trying to be creative and trying to figure out this crazy thing called life without worrying about offending someone or stepping on their ideological toes. In so many words, sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. The original universities were set up behind walls so that students and professors could engage in a real discussion that could go anywhere without worrying about causing a riot, without worrying about being punished by the authorities, without being called horrible names. And today's universities, many of them at least, have betrayed that heritage, and they have become factories of indoctrination and propaganda. That is my opinion. As you explore your own future in universities, you may find that you think I'm wrong. Join the club. If you already think I'm wrong, I'm going to give you time to express yourselves. But I will tell you that the original purpose of universities was to think the forbidden thoughts that might lead to new ideas that might make the world a better place. If you're not willing to risk bad thought, wrong thought, offensive thought, dangerous thought, you're never going to come up with new ideas. Does anyone wish to offer a different opinion on today's colleges or any of that? Please.
Well,
and thank you.
I was just wondering, didn't if like certain opinions in these universities that were walled off, what if people outside of universities found out about things that you said inside? Was it just accepted that they wouldn't judge,
Oh no, they judge.
or was it like people could be shunned because of their
Totally.
ideology?
Yeah, that's why. No, everyone understood. Look, people can be smart, individuals at least. But you get groups of people in a city who have all the pressures of life and they're ready to snap anyway. And something comes along and offends them, you're just this close to a riot. So people understood within the university that this is sort of a deal between us, that we're going to say things here. But if word gets out, oh, there'll be consequences, and there were riots, there were lynchings, there were all sorts of things. One of the things that biologists did, they weren't called biologists then, they were called natural philosophers. But one of the things that people did when they were trying to learn about medicine is, well, the best way to understand the way a human body is put together is to get a hold of a human body. But living human people don't like being cut on for science, especially without anesthesia. So what was necessary was recently dead people, cadavers. It was normal for people from universities and especially the medical department to be sneaking out, looking at graveyards to dig up the recently dead, to bring them back and cut them open and see how people are put together and do experiments. It was, they thought, a reasonable and necessary thing to do for science, right? But that's not a cadaver. That's Uncle Ed! You're taking Uncle Ed from his sanctified grave in a society that believes in the resurrection of the body, which is a theological doctrine that says, no, you shouldn't be cremated as a Christian. You should be buried because the body will be revivified. And, and you're doing basically, what's it called? You take a body apart. Autopsy. Oh, there's another name for it. In any event, biology class, you might do it with frogs. Dissecting. Thank you. God, why can't I think this way? You're dissecting people. You're dissecting the bodies of the recently dead. Again and again, when the medical students or professors are caught doing this, they're burned at the stake as witches, as wizards, as necromancers, as evildoers. Because they're not burning up they're not digging up anonymous people. They're digging up beloved relations. So everyone had to be extremely careful about this. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Have anything else to say? Just raise your hand. Does anyone else wish to? By the way, I'm not trying to make you down on college. I'm just trying to open your eyes. College has wonders to offer, but it also has some problems today. And one of the problems is, for reasons that I can't fathom, it has become acceptable to have an ideological litmus test. And where people actually say, oh, you don't agree with me? You must be either stupid or evil. And that's fanaticism. Good people, people of goodwill, smart people, have believed all sorts of things throughout history. And if you believe in freedom of speech, that freedom of speech has to include communists and Klansmen and all the other variants of ideas out there. If you're not willing to allow the free speech of communists or Klansmen, you have closed free speech down and replaced it with a limited speech. Please.
So I'm sure this is exactly like on, but like we're supposed to be a place where you can have any, like some religious universities like Gonzaga, you have to like take part.
Yeah, that's different. If you go to a Catholic university like Gonzaga, and understand, modern Catholicism has very little resemblance to what I learned when I was a kid, when I was growing up Catholic. The Catholic Church has really changed a lot in the last 40 or 50 years. But if you're going to a Catholic university like Notre Dame, you should expect that Catholicism is going to be a part of what your life is going to be. And you sign up for that. If I were to go to Brigham Young University, which is a Latter-day Saint oriented college, I wouldn't. But if I did, I would expect that a certain degree of Mormonism would be entering my life, at least while I was there. That's a voluntary choice that a student makes, and the same is true if you go to a place like University of California at Berkeley. That college, that university has a reputation for highly left-wing radical thought. And if you go to UCal Berkeley, you should expect that. My problem is that mainstream schools that don't have these strong identities with particular ideology, have become places where you almost never see an openly conservative professor, and any openly conservative students either are living like an oppressed minority, or they just shut up and don't express it because they're afraid. They don't want to deal with it. They don't want to deal with some crazy person yelling in their face that you're evil. I don't mind there being universities out there that have certain identities. I mind that most all universities seem to be taking on an identity that is in common. And that leaves what's the college that takes no money? Hillsdale. That leaves Hillsdale and a handful of other universities that are traditionally conservative oriented against hundreds or thousands that are now very, very left leaning. Does that make any sense? Okay. Does anyone have anything else to say on the whole university thing? Yes, please.
So I also felt like it's really hard to express your own, especially like in just regular schools nowadays, because I feel like there's this new attitude that like the teacher is always correct. And like it's ridiculous.
I'm not always correct. I'm wrong all the time.
Yeah.
Just ask my wife; she'll tell you.
Yeah, but there's like some teachers that believe that like what they're doing is correct and that you should conform to that.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's very new.
It's not as new as you'd think. I experienced it too. I didn't experience it much in high school, but it has percolated into not only high schools but elementary schools. God forbid you question the doctrine of man-made climate change in certain science classrooms. You know, they're going to view you like a flat earther or a Holocaust denier. In fact, the term climate change denier is in focus. I hope that you understand by now that you can express almost any idea in here, and I'm not going to be offended by it. We all have opinions. For any teacher to lose sight of the fact that there's objective fact and there's opinion, and there's a blending point, and to lose one of the basic ethics of being a teacher is you can't allow yourself to be seduced by the idea that because you're professing things, your ideas are right. It's that very thing it's kryptonite for teachers. It's poisonous. And it develops a rightful contempt on the part of students and families for the teaching profession. Drives me nuts. I've seen a couple of conservative teachers that have this idea. People have said this of me. I really, really, really don't believe that what I think is objectively right. And I really, really do try to prove that I like people to express different ideas. Because that's important. That's what brings a classroom alive. But I've had teachers that downgraded my work because I wasn't left-leaning and I wasn't willing to use their language. They tried controlling the words I spoke and the conclusions I came to, and if it wasn't ideologically correct, then I was punished. And I ended up failing out of Bates in my second semester of senior year because I was so angry about this that I wasn't a very good student back then anyway. I was very undisciplined. But I got so angry, I became more interested in the fight for my freedom to express myself as a student than I was in passing. And it took me 3 years to go to night school to finish that last semester. No, I can't stand it when teachers do that. Have sympathy for them because they've gone over the deep end. And it's a terrible thing to lose your perspective. I say this with sympathy for them, but you also should have the right to express an alternative point of view as long as you're respectful, as long as you're productive in doing it. You know, saying to a teacher, you're a bleeping, bleep, 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 and I don't, that's not productive. But I'm sure that what you would argue in a classroom would be loyal opposition at worst. And loyal opposition is a healthy thing in democracy. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
You have anything else to say before?
No, I just really.
Okay. Yeah. No, if we can't be free to say 2 + 2 is 4, we're not free. And 2 + 2 is going to mean different things to different people. That's the joy of freedom. There's not one truth out there. For so many things, there are many truths. Yes?
I think overall a big part of the problem is just how radicalized everything's become on both sides, and in any ideology. It's just people, they don't want to compromise ever, and it's like you want to have open discussions and try and talk about certain things, but then it's always coming off as you're wrong, you're incorrect, and it's like I think we really have to remember that we have to stay open-minded to everybody's opinions, because it's when we have people, in our lives who are very, this is the only thing that's right, I can't listen to anything else because I've simply made up my mind.
Mhm.
I think that becomes a big issue, and that's what I see a lot of anyways, and just
On
with
both sides.
everyone. It's, on both sides, where it's nobody wants to listen or really hear the other person's thoughts because it becomes too difficult.
In any disagreement, in any argument, you can either be dedicated to winning, or you can be dedicated to getting through this in a way that's both has integrity and that's going to allow you to continue to function together in the future. In other words, caring more about the relationship than you do about winning the argument. I don't believe in political persuasion. I stopped believing that when the towers burned and fell. Something in me died that day. I used to love debating, and I used to actually have this arrogant idea that I could persuade someone. I don't think that. What I insist on is my ability to speak freely in all situations, frankly and freely. People can disagree, they can call me names, they can do what they want, but I insist on being able to speak freely. And I agree that other people should have that same right, as long as they're not inciting riots and violence and things like that. We are Americans, left and right, liberal, conservative. We have so much more in common than divides us. That flag represents a society that's genuinely diverse. You know what diversity means? It doesn't just mean the color of your skin or your gender. It means liberals and conservatives agreeing that we're all one people, disagreeing about where we should go, fighting, and then making up. It used to be that when a president won an election, right or wrong, there was a honeymoon period, a few weeks, few months, maybe a year, where everyone got behind him. I never agreed with much of anything that Barack Obama stood for. But I wrote a letter to the editor back in Maine saying he's my president and I want him to succeed for the good of the country when he was first inaugurated. Not because I liked his policies, but because that's what you do. Good sportsmanship is something that's not just for the athletic field. It is a recognition that behind the shake and the good game is we're all in this together. We've lost that. And we've lost it to a greater degree. It's not totally gone. The fact that you can say that and I can say this and other people might agree indicates what we're hoping for is something that is it's as close to a universal hope as there is, that we can have real discussions that are principled and disagreement without ripping ourselves apart, without another civil war. Where we're going right now, if it continues with this degree of intensity, is a second civil war, or at the very least, the splitting of the country. I don't want that, because I know what America is for the world. Do I want President Trump to appoint a Supreme Court justice now? No, I don't. I don't want the Democrats to either. But at this moment, I have to say, back in 2016, I didn't support Barack Obama appointing a justice so close to the election. And I am consistent in the belief that I think that it should be left to whoever wins the election. Personally, I think Trump might win. But I may be being hopeful from my own personal point of view. If you don't have a degree of consistency that's beyond winning the current argument, it's very hard to step away from win at all costs. And what I hope for each of you is that you have your own beliefs and that you have integrity. And that means being honest enough to look at your own beliefs critically from time to time. And that means understanding the difference between fact and your opinion. And that means standing up for what you believe, come what may. That's what makes a free society work. That's what makes us worthy of being free. If all we are a bunch of hungry animals looking for our next meal, then we're not worthy of being free, and we won't long be free. That's a little bit more preachy than I intended, but you asked very good questions and brought up very good thoughts, so thank you. I've got to move on just for the sake of time. Or do I? Okay, so we've talked about castles, guilds, the university. The High Middle Ages includes the Christian response to Islamic jihad, which are Christian crusades. After being on the receiving end of holy war, Islamic holy war for 400 plus years, Christians decide, okay, let's try some of that. So Pope Urban II declares a crusade to recapture the Holy Land. The slogan is Deus Vult, God wills it, or Gott mit uns, God is with us. The Crusades are failed. They don't last. Some of the Holy Land is captured for a while, but the longest lasting Crusader state, which is at Acre, is just over 100 years. So the Crusades, an attempt to recapture for Christ the Holy Land now occupied by the Muslims, is a failure. And crusading never really takes off in Western civilization, in Christian civilization. The closest it comes is in Spain. And remember, Spain has the strongest Arabic influence. In Spain, you've got a 700-plus year war called Reconquista, where the Christian kingdoms in Spain marched down from these mountain fastnesses where they hole up in during the initial conquest, and by 1492 they reconquer Spain. That almost Arab sense of Christian, of La Cruzada continues in Cortez's conquest of Mexico and Pizarro in Peru and some of the stuff that's done with the Indians in South America. But in general terms, crusading is not an ongoing thing in the West. The last time we do it on a large scale is during the wars of religion between Catholics and Protestants in the 15 and 1600s, and we'll talk about that. What ends the High Middle Ages is climate change, among other things. A cold phase called the Little Ice Age begins. Before the Little Ice Age, you have Viking colonies growing grapes, wine grapes, in Newfoundland, which is way north of where any wine grapes can grow today. You've got wine grapes being grown in Scotland. They can't be grown in Scotland. They're outside of a greenhouse. The climate had warmed 1,000 years ago. It was one of the things that made the High Middle Ages so prosperous, because the farmland was actually producing bumper crops most years. But in the late 1100s, probably because the world got so warm that the ocean currents changed, we end up with a cold snap. We end up with a few years without a summer, which in a subsistence farming economy is death. And this cold snap is going to shake the Mongols loose in Asia. They're going to make a lot of history because their lands become noticeably colder. It's going to reduce crop yields, making everyone hungrier. And basically it brings on the sort of long, grim twilight period that is the late Middle Ages. And that's what we'll talk about tomorrow. Any thoughts or questions? Thank you guys for the conversation. That's a big part of what I like to do when we have the time. Tomorrow my plan is to do the late Middle Ages and get us ready for the Renaissance. I will predict that there's probably going to be a quiz sometime soon about this summary of ancient and medieval history before the Renaissance, around the time we get to here, which is the shift into strict study of the Renaissance. So, questions? Okay, I'll be shutting the video off and the stream off. Thank you for your attention.